ladies and gentlemen. Great pleasure to be back here in Addis. Thank you very much, Matt, for the introduction. And as I'm sure you've become accustomed to, I will be giving the annual update on hotel performance data. So this is our agenda for today. So we'll look, first of all, Pan-African. We'll look at how the continent's doing. We'll look at the supply picture. And then we'll look at some key cities before we go and look at the Big Five. Of course, we're in Africa, so a deep dive on the Big Five before we look into the future with our pipeline. So without further ado, how does Africa stack up? So this is supply, so rooms available, and demand, rooms sold, percentage change for July year to date. And please note that all of the data that I will present today will be for July year to date. And if we look at the supply-demand equilibrium for Africa, first of all, supply. Whilst there are many, many cities across this continent which are challenged by supply growth, which I'll come onto in lots of detail, across Africa as a whole, it's really not an issue. Just 1.1% growth in supply this year to date. Demand is growing faster than in many developed regions, as you can see, 3.3%. So the economics, the core economics of the African hotel industry are pretty good. And that's translated into RevPAR. So here we have supply, demand, and RevPAR percentage change over a long-term period. And note supply has been pretty flat, just ticking up a little bit over the last couple of years. But if you look at 17, 18, 6% growth in demand, 3.5% this year, it's solid. And throughout this time period as well, consistent RevPAR growth. And that's cumulative, of course. So it's growth upon growth upon growth. Or to put it another way, on a rolling 12 basis, we've seen 86, or now 87, because we've just got our August numbers in, 87 consecutive months of RevPAR growth across Africa as a whole. It's a good statistic to be able to bring you. So if we look at the actuals, 59% occupancy, so maybe a tad below an international average. Average rate's 110 US, pretty standard when we look globally. And you can see there a nice split of growth between occupancy and rate to see RevPAR coming in just shy of 5% year to date. So how big is the market? Now, it's been mentioned in the prior two panels, but this is a slide we brought you last year, and I bring it back because I think it really does just put into perspective how vast this continent is geographically. The fact that you can fit the US, China, India, Japan, and most of Europe into Africa shows the geographic vastness. But there are only circa 5,000 hotels here, commercial establishments north of 10 rooms. And that's approximately 200 times fewer than the countries that fit inside it geographically. So it really does showcase nicely the scale of the opportunity here. And you can see where those rooms are on this chart. Now, there are only 4 nations with more than 50,000 keys: Egypt, Tunisia, South Africa, and Morocco. And then there's a big drop down to the next tranche of 10,000 or above. And there's only 3 nations there: Kenya, Nigeria, and Ghana. And to give you some international comparisons, there are more hotel rooms in Cambodia than in Kenya. There are more hotel rooms than in Slovakia, Slovenia, or Sri Lanka than there are in either Ghana or Nigeria. And when you think about the opportunity, the population, they're really staggering comparisons. I first started presenting this slide 6 years ago at AHIF, and 6 years ago we had 18 countries across the continent with no internationally branded hotels. Today, that number is just 7. So you can see the expansion of the international operators. And if you then look at the regional brands, the African brands, it's just 5. Just 5 countries now with no branded supply at all. So that's grown significantly. But who are the biggest players? Well, this data is taken from the STR 500, which is a list of biggest operators and biggest brands. And it was really close. But the biggest operators, Accor and Marriott, just 4 rooms. Just 4 rooms in it. Really staggering to see that. And then you've got Radisson, Xinjiang, Louvre, in third place, and then the first African brand there, Sogo Sun, in fourth. Interesting as well, I think, to note, Tui and Riu, resort brands focused on the north of the continent, but when you look at it across Africa as a whole, just how big a player they actually are. It surprised me. The biggest brand? Well, it's Hilton, followed by Protea, Radisson Blu, and then Riu. But let's now move from supply to look at performance. Now, I'm sure over the next few days, we are going to hear a huge amount about growth and about how much we've seen across Africa as a whole. And I think, although of course I am biased, one way to look at the growth of a continent from a hotel perspective is to look at STR's coverage and the transparency we bring to the industry. Now, I've reformatted it, but this was data I first presented. Ignore the numbers, don't take any pictures. This was data, this is year-end 2012, and this was STR's coverage across Africa in 2012. This is STR's coverage in 2019 across Africa, and we haven't included all of the South African markets that we can include either, just because we ran out of space. But this is percentage change year to date, and as you would expect across Africa, there's a huge variance, a huge variety across the continent as a whole. But widely speaking, if you look across the north, it's doing well, it's recovering, particularly Egypt, still coming back from the challenges we have seen over recent years. And you've just got Casablanca and Algiers there, which are challenged by supply growth. And supply growth is a consistent picture when we look at many cities across Africa. On this map alone, Conakry, Abidjan, Nairobi, Lusaka, Kampala, all of these cities are in negative territory because of new supply coming in. But there are positives here as well, and many of them. Accra, one of the great cities of the continent, of course, the Ghanaian economy picking up, doing well. And other pockets as well, Kinshasa, Gaborone, Maputo, Mozambique's rich natural resources, all helping to drive hotel performance. And here, Addis Ababa, 6%. Now, whilst that doesn't seem spectacular, for me that is the most impressive number on the chart. And as I move through the presentation, you'll see why. But what does that mean in terms of actual performance, so actual levels of occupancy? Now, what we've done here is we've given you a traffic light code, so 50% occupancy or below, red, 65% and above is green. And again, there are some differences across the continent, but I think really what we can do here is we can split the continent into three parts. So we've got Northern Africa to begin with, and then we've got tranche in the middle, Sub-Saharan Africa in the middle, and then South Africa somewhat stands alone. And if you look across the north, it's pretty decent. It's pretty good. These are mature markets, more developed hotel markets, and you can see there the occupancy levels are higher. But where we get the best occupancy levels are in those markets which have a nice combination of both leisure demand and corporate demand. And you can see that Agadir, Marrakesh, Alexandria, Cairo, cities that can fill their hotels 7 nights a week. As we move to Sub-Saharan Africa, in that middle tranche that I mentioned, that's where we have a change. These are predominantly still corporate markets, some MICE business, but very little leisure business. And as a result, we're seeing lower occupancies. The other thing I would mention is these are the developing markets across Africa. And some of the new markets that STR can now report on, such as Conakry, Bamako, Kigali, Kampala, all low occupancy markets because they've seen such an influx of new supply over recent years, and they're still absorbing that. And then move down to South Africa. Again, you see a more mature market, more domestic business, of course, higher occupancies, with Cape Town above those other South African markets, again because of the mix of business and leisure. So that's occupancy. What about rate? Well, again, huge differences across the continent, but very much in line with and correlations with the occupancies. So if we start in the north again, lower rated business generally, more supply, of course, markets still recovering. Egypt, still recovering, devaluation of the pound and so forth. It's really just Marrakesh that stands out there. And of course, there's a lot of high-end supply in that market. But then when you come south to that middle tranche again, corporate business, limited supply, hoteliers can push average rates. And to give you, again, some international comparisons, Kinshasa has higher ADR than London. Abuja has higher ADR than Tokyo, and here in Addis, you'll pay about what you pay in Hong Kong. So it gives you some idea of just how high those average rates are across the continent from an international comparative perspective. Again, moving down to South Africa, more domestic business, more supply, so it's lower ADR, but again, Cape Town coming out that little bit higher. So when we look at the RevPAR splits, again, we've bucketed them, high, medium, low. And most of the cities, as you can see, medium or low from a RevPAR perspective. But those ones are high. Of course, the Seychelles, Mauritius, those long-haul luxury destinations. And then you've got those markets that drive RevPAR through rate. Kinshasa, as I mentioned, Abuja, Addis, Accra. And Dakar is sitting there as well. Dakar is doing very well, 70% occupancy, average rates of just shy of 150 US. So let's stick with Dakar as we start our deep dive on the big 5 stories, and Dakar is driving forward. And we can see that with our rolling RevPAR chart here, percentage change, indexed on 2014. Now, there was a slight dip in Dakar, as there was across pretty much all of Francophone West Africa, as there were a number of terror attacks around 2015, 2016. But since that recovery, it's been up, up, up. Even some domestic unrest has not really damaged the RevPAR growth that we've seen in Dakar. And the new opening of the international airport, though, that for me is a huge intention for the city. More demand is going to be coming in, they need to cater for it. But of course, when a market is doing well, more people want a part of that. So when we look at the pipeline, this map is taken from STR's AMPM platform, which is a mapping tool showing you existing and future supply. And each of those yellow dots represents a pipeline project. And what I've done here as well is shown you the cumulative growth of supply if all of those projects in the pipeline come to fruition. Supply will more than double by 2022 in Dakar. So that's going to be a challenge for the market. But of course, one way a market can fill those rooms is through events. And in 2022, Dakar will be the first African city to host the Youth Olympics. So it will welcome the world to Dakar, to Senegal, to Africa. And you see the RevPAR percentage change there when Buenos Aires hosted the event last year. It should be a really positive event and a great showcase for the city, the country, and the continent. So let's now move from the west down to the south and have a quick look at Cape Town. And Cape Town really is a story of two things. It's a story of water and a story of supply. Now this graphic, if we look at it at face value, it shows you that Cape Town's actually growing quite nicely this year to date, outperforming the national average for South Africa with what I would call a healthy pipeline, not a concerning pipeline. But then we have to drill a little bit deeper and look at what actually happened, particularly last year. And this, again, is our RevPAR percentage change and our supply percentage change on a rolling 12 basis for Cape Town. Now, you'll see there, supply was flat for a long period of time post the World Cup before we had a spike of 5% last year. That, unfortunately, coincided, of course, with the water shortage and the damage to international perception that did to the city. So we saw quite a sharp softening of RevPAR after many years of double-digit growth. So where we are now in Cape Town is recovery. It's growing, but it's not yet up, from a RevPAR perspective anyway, at the levels we saw in 16 or 17 as of yet. It's getting there, but in recovery mode at present. And now I'd like to move from the very south to the very north of the continent and look at Casablanca, and that's a quote from the movie, in case any of you are wondering what I'm talking about there. And Casablanca is really bucking the trend for Morocco, but not in a positive way. So Morocco is actually doing very well. As you can see, most markets across the country growing, but Casablanca 18% down, supply-driven. Demand has been flat, but supply-driven. And that is, as you can see, down in RevPAR. And if you look at the actuals, it's quite interesting that actually Casablanca, the financial hub, the economic hub of Morocco, has a far, far lower, almost 50% lower RevPAR than Marrakesh, far more in line with Agadir. But it has been all about supply. And you can see here that correlation. Supply's up 13% this year to date. So as the supplies, the red line shoots up, the RevPAR is coming down. So challenge for Casablanca. But the good news, I guess, for the city is that there are only 4 hotels in the active pipeline at the moment, just over 750 keys. So we won't see this huge plethora of new supply coming in anytime soon. So from the north to the east, and I want to finish with 2 cities in this part of the continent. Last year, we were in Nairobi, of course, and I was talking about green shoots. But now I've changed that, and I'm talking about migrating south. Now, Nairobi has had a challenging time over recent years, and you see all the different events here that have impacted the hotel industry. But one thing remains consistent over this time period is that supply growth has consistently outperformed demand growth. And although both of those have flattened off over the last year or so, we are still seeing a slight softening of occupancy, and candidly, 50%, not a particularly high level of occupancy. But where they're really hurting in Nairobi is rates. All those new hotels coming in is having certainly an impact on rate, and you can see there quite a significant RevPAR decline. But it doesn't end there. 30% more to come in terms of supply across Nairobi by 2022. Again, something we're going to have to watch very closely. And then the final city of the Big Five, Addis Ababa. And you can see here my tagline, Addis Ababa ascends. And remember, at the beginning of the presentation, I talked about that 6%, and I talked about it being, for me, probably the most impressive growth of any city on the continent, even though it was just 6%. So the market's growing, but why is it growing? Well, firstly, we've just heard Ethiopian Airlines, right? They bring the world to Addis Ababa. They bring the world to Ethiopia with their extensive route network. That combined with, of course, as we all know, the diplomatic capital of Africa, African Union, multiple NGOs, multiple World Heritage, so UNESCO World Heritage sites across this country, and a booming economy. It's a recipe for success. And you can see that in this chart. So this is why I think this 6% is so impressive. If you look over recent years, look at the supply growth that this city has had. It has been significant. But look at the demand for the last 2 years. 14% last year, 20% this year to date. That's in the face of supply growing 17%. So any market that has a 17% increase in supply but can still grow its RevPAR 6% is doing pretty well in my book. But of course, as always, when a market is doing well, people want more. And this candidly is a little bit scary. All those yellow dots represent a pipeline project. 82% increase in supply by 2022. And if you look at who is developing here, it really is a who's who of the international hotel players. Marriott, Hilton, Hyatt, IHG, Accor, Best Western, Wyndham. And then you have Bonn Hotels. We've got the Skylight expansion, Sarova. And I apologize to any operators in the audience who are developing here that I haven't mentioned. But you get the picture. There is huge appetite. And then in addition, interestingly, once you come out of Addis Ababa, there are 1,750 keys in the pipeline throughout the rest of Ethiopia. The appetite for this country from the international hotel industry is vast. So just to finish off, but staying with our look into the future, just our pipeline. These are the top cities for active pipeline projects across Africa. No real changes. Cairo still retains top spot, 6,000 keys there, but Addis, 5,500. We're tracking 26 projects here. Nairobi, and Lagos, north of 3,000 keys, and every other city on this chart north of 1,000 keys as well. Two cities that didn't quite make the 1,000 rooms, but I think worth mentioning, Cotonou in Benin and Niamey in Niger. Both have significant growth coming in, certainly as a percentage of existing supply. But then coming back just to finish to the STR 500 and those pipeline, who are the biggest players in terms of pipeline? Well, it's the usual suspects. You can see there the big four, certainly in terms of pipeline development, Accor, Marriott, Hilton, and then Radisson, Louvre, and Xinjiang. And the biggest brands, once again, it's Hilton, followed by Radisson Blu, Ibis Styles, Marriott, and Movenpick. But note, no African brands in our top 8, either operators or brands. We are tracking them. But they are growing, but they are not growing at the same rate as the international players. So this continent will become more and more international brand heavy as we move forward. So to conclude, and this is very similar to what we said last year, but I don't think things have changed dramatically. Huge opportunity, but it's not for the faint-hearted. We all know about the rapidly developing infrastructure and economies here. That's already been discussed. But supply is an issue, particularly when it all comes at once. Well, that's what we need to watch. Opportunities can be hard to come by, but they are there, of course. And political, economic, safety challenges, they still remain. But the one thing I have to say, I've been presenting here now for 9 years, and I've spoken far less about these challenges today than I have in prior years. And I think that's a really good news story for Africa, because I think Africa is a good news story. We're seeing growth, we're seeing development, and at STR we look forward to continue to be able to provide you with that transparency and data across this incredibly exciting continent. And with that, I will say thank you very much indeed for your time.